we find ourselves in routines, which we were able to cope with solely because we had this surfeit of energy. We don't have that anymore. And that's when we have our midlife crisis, when we come face to face with the fact that we're not really equipped to do what we've taken on.
What is a midlife crisis?
I would define a midlife crisis as that period in an adult's life when the deficits in their mental health catch up with them.
What does that mean?
Okay, so what is our mental health? Well, we're not just talking about our ability to think, to learn. When we're talking about our mental health, we're also talking about our emotional health. We're talking about our ability to cope with our emotions, whether or not we suppress our emotions. Our mental health will be as good or as bad as our upbringing, because that's when our mental health is formed. Our mental health is formed when we're parented. Essentially, we are taught through the way we are treated to be the people we're going to be. Most families, we'd like to think families are these loving, healthy places where children grow up secure, and that's the ideal. To a greater or lesser extent, that's not true. I'm going to give you a quote from a very famous Russian author, Leo Tolstoy, who writes, "All happy families are happy in the same way, but all unhappy families are happy in many, many different ways."
Are happy in many
Are
different
unhappy.
Unhappy.
Thank you. Unhappy in many different ways. So what's he saying? He's saying, look, to the extent that people are not particularly mature when they have children, not particularly healthy, they're not going to do for their children what their children need. What does a child need? Well, a child needs to be cared for. They need to be nurtured. They need to be taken care of by people whose sole interest is in satisfying the child's needs and not their own. Most people aren't up for that all the time. Most people...
Why?
Because they're not particularly well themselves.
Well, in what way?
They didn't get parented very well. And when you don't get parented very well, instead of dedicating yourself to the satisfaction of your child's needs, you see the child as a means of getting your own needs satisfied. And most of the time, parents who do that are unconscious of the fact that they're doing it. They have no idea that that's what they're doing, but it is what they're doing.
How would they use their child to satisfy their own needs?
Well, I've heard this expression, you get a particularly immature young lady, say of 14, and she's got pregnant. Somebody says, well, why did you get pregnant? So finally I'll have somebody to love me. Now, here's my question to you. What's wrong with that statement?
You're using someone.
Yeah. Child's job is not to love you. Your job is to love the child.
Unconditionally?
Yes. That's what it is to be a parent. To love a child even if they don't love you back. To love a child when they're not lovable. Children need that, or they'll never learn to love. So you ask, what causes parents to be of poor mental health? As children, they weren't loved. And they certainly weren't loved unconditionally. If you put conditions on a child's love, in a sense, you're trading with them or you're blackmailing them to do what you want them to do so that you get your needs met. Parents do that all the time. And when you do that, you traumatize your children. And when a child is traumatized, the feelings they had around the trauma are going to be feelings they can't cope with. So they suppress them. And they don't feel them, and they're not aware when they're having them. And they tend to act them out in the unhealthy ways that they saw their parents acted out the same emotions when they traumatized.
But James, isn't all of this a bit extreme though? Like, because aren't there people from very well-adjusted families, children, and they have things wrong with them, or they're emotionally stunted, and you have people who are neglected or whatever, and then they do come out, they're very caring and selfless.
That's a really good question. I'll give you the answer. Families that have been able to present themselves or have been given a lot of help as presenting themselves as well-adjusted often turn out children who are not well-adjusted. But notice how I described that. Families who present themselves as well-adjusted or are given the privilege of being seen as well-adjusted turn out children who are not well-adjusted. Now, what am I saying there? I'm saying there are a lot of families that look really well-adjusted that aren't. Now, are we surprised about that? Should that surprise us? I don't think so. That's the first thing. Secondly, and this is the interesting thing, in a family that is not well-adjusted, the children are essentially meeting the needs of the parents, and the parents will have needs that shift over time and that change with the family dynamic, which is a fancy way of saying as more children come into the family, the needs of the parents will change because often the parents will be in conflict and they'll need allies and they'll need scapegoats so that not all children will be treated in the same way in the same family. One of the things that a family that is not particularly well adjusted may well need is a caretaker. Parents can't really take care of the children, so there's a child who's going to be designated the caretaker. And they're going to be taught to feel really badly about themselves if they're not picking up the pieces after everybody else in the family, especially their parents. Now, that brings with it its own craziness, but it also is a foundation unintentionally for strength. You have a problem solver. You have someone who takes responsibility. Take responsibility for themselves. Why? Because that's what was required of them.
How old are people when they have these midlife crises?
So let's say I have had a run-of-the-mill traumatic childhood. I'm a bit messed up. So as long as I'm fairly young, like yourself, I'm going to have the plasticity and energy of the young. And when we have plasticity and energy, we're able to do things even though we're a bit messed up. We usually, if we're men, we have to get our heads together before we can do that, which is about the time an adult male is 26. They sort of say, I've been kind of wasting my life on foolish things, and I've been a fool, and it's time to smarten up.
And why
And
26?
there are a couple of reasons. First of all, the hormones that drove us to be really quite crazy in our teens and early 20s start to drop off. But secondly, and I think more importantly, the adolescent brain finally matures to a fully adult brain. You know, we think adolescent ends at 19 because we associate adolescence with the teen years. But that's actually false. At least in males, adolescents tend to or individuals tend to have the development of an adolescent brain till about the time they're 26. So suddenly we have this fully developed adult brain. We're not driven crazy by our hormones, and the behaviors which would make sense to an immature brain charged with an enormous number of hormones who doesn't have a lot of experience in life are going to look crazy. And we're going to say, well, can't act like this. This is insane. And we still have a lot of energy. So, we buckle down, even though, we're not the most emotionally healthy people. We have this energy to overcome that. We buckle down and we put our lives in some semblance of order. And that lasts until we're usually in our late 30s and 40s. Now we're getting to the time of the midlife crisis. What happens? Well, I can tell you from experience that wonderful plasticity, that surfeit of energy, which makes you feel kind of immortal in your 20s and early 30s, dissipates pretty quickly, and our bodies start to age. Not only that, we find ourselves in routines which we were able to cope with solely because we had this surfeit of energy. We don't have that anymore. Now, why did we get into routines that we had to cope with, that were really not really what we wanted? Were not really that healthy for us. I mean, they may have looked good from the outside. Everybody around us say, you're doing fine. But it wasn't really us. Why did we do that? Well, we did that because we weren't very healthy to begin with. But we could make it look good. We could make it work because we had all this energy. And along the way, what did we do? Well, part of our lives was establishing relationships, probably, with a partner, set up house together, had children, took on the role of working out a partnership that was supposed to be lifelong, and took on children who were supposed to be nurtured and loved unconditionally. Now, did we really have the ability to do that? Well, no. And we didn't do it particularly well. That we did it at all, we did it because we had all this energy. Now we don't. And that's when we have our midlife crisis. When we come face to face with the fact that we're not really equipped to do what we've taken on.